Let's turn now to our second objection. The objection that Paul never mentions the Nativity in his writings in the New Testament. The argument is really what Paul doesn't say. And the skeptics they would say that Paul does not directly mention Jesus' virgin birth or the details surrounding it. The Nativity as we see it. You know, it's a big part of our culture in America. The Nativity. We put nativities up at Christmas. We fight over nativities in public spaces. We got baby Jesus in the manger and the three wise men and all of that. That's a big, in our culture, that's a big sort of visual image at Christmas. But the objection is, well, look, Paul doesn't mention this. This is a big thing. How is it that Paul didn't mention it? Did he not even know about it? And so the idea here is you can see the skeptic's mind is working. The skeptic is going, Paul didn't mention this. The Gospels mention it. Maybe Paul's writings were first. Most of his writings came before the Gospels, depending on how you date things. It's difficult to know the exact dates. But the idea is, well, look, Paul wrote some of his stuff first. He didn't know about the Nativity. Later on, the apostles write their Gospels. They made it up. That's what it was. Paul didn't know about it because it was made up. Let's deal with this. Did Paul not know about the Nativity? And is this a valid argument for the unreliability of the Bible? A few considerations here. First of all, Mark and John don't include any details on it either. Keep that in mind. 2 of the 4 Gospels don't give us that nativity account, that the story, the factual story of what happened at Jesus' birth. So are we going to say that those 2 Gospels are not valid either? Or is there another reason they might not have focused on that in their Gospels? Secondly, remember that Paul only mentioned the Lord's Supper once. We talk about the Lord's Supper. That's one of the basic doctrines of the Christian faith. It's one of the ordinances, we call it, or rules or laws that we're supposed to practice the Lord's Supper, the bread and the wine. But he only mentions that one time. Did he not think that was important? Did he not know about that? There's nobody doing it, you see? Why didn't he mention that? And it really comes down, this third point here is very important. What we have to realize is that we talk about Mark and John not detailing it. We talk about Paul only mentioning the Lord's Supper once and not giving the details. It is true, Paul didn't give an account of the Nativity. He didn't say, you know, all these things happened and the 3 wise men and all of that. He didn't do that. But what we have to realize is the New Testament authors, they were living in a time of dynamic early Christianity. The church was getting started, the faith was moving out freshly into the world, and they were dealing with all kinds of issues. The gospel writers, it's clear that when they wrote their gospels, they are writing to different audiences. They are writing to accomplish different kinds of purposes. That doesn't mean that they were not telling truth about Jesus and the accounts of his life and his words. It simply means that they were choosing things out of Jesus' teaching, choosing things out of Jesus' life that served the purpose that they had in their writing. You know, I'm an author. I like to write books. And one thing I've learned about writing, and it's true of speaking too, you cannot write everything there is to be written about everything. And it's hard for preachers, but we can't preach everything that needs to be preached every time we speak. You have to cut down what you're including, what you're talking about. Even when you're quoting a verse, sometimes I will take out parts of that verse that don't apply to what I'm trying to get across because it's only going to confuse the reader or the hearer, the listener. And I don't want to spend the time on that. I'm just focusing on this part of the verse and not that part. So Paul was going around establishing churches, and he is dealing with all kinds of practical problems, day in and day out, trying to solve problems. So his books were not written as these long, verbose, end-all, be-all accounts of everything possible in Christianity. He was writing to deal with issues, and he was applying truth and God's Word and God's principles and Jesus' life and Jesus' teachings to help solve and deal with those issues. Even in the mention of the Lord's Supper, as I read in one commentary, he's doing that because there was a problem with the Lord's Supper. The way they were carrying on, he needed to address it. So he may not have even mentioned the Lord's Supper directly if he hadn't had this problem. So it's not fair for us to do this. One of the resources I found online, there's a guy named J. Warner Wallace, a website called Cold Case Christianity. And I don't know a lot about this, so I'm not giving a blanket approval or of this website. But he had a very good article on the subject of why didn't Paul mention the virgin conception and the nativity. And he talks about this whole issue of Paul having a purpose in writing and therefore just not needing to talk about it. But in his quote here, he mentions a couple of other things that are very interesting as well. So let's read his quote and let's just consider the points that he's making. He says, we need to be very careful about drawing conclusions from silence. In other words, he's saying the fact that Paul didn't mention something doesn't mean that he didn't know about it. Like I said, you can't mention everything all the time. Paul may not have mentioned the virgin conception simply because it was widely understood or assumed. Remember, Paul is dealing with problems. He is a fixer. He is the divine fixer. So he's not going to spend his time on something that's well understood, that there's no controversy about or no issue to be discussed. He goes on, Paul may also have been silent because it was not the focus or purpose of his letters, this is what we're talking about, which are often devoted to issues related to the church. So that's the point that we've been making. So he doesn't mention it because everybody understood it and there was no controversy, and therefore it was not the focus of his letters. But he goes on. He says, remember that Paul was a contemporary of Luke. Paul appears to be very familiar with Luke's gospel. He quotes Luke in 1 Timothy 5:17 through 18 and 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 26. If Paul disagreed with Luke's account of the conception, we would expect to hear Paul say something about it in his letters. Paul never refuted or openly questioned the claims of Luke regarding the virgin conception. So Wallace's article is focusing on this issue of the virgin conception, but it ties into the whole nativity issue itself. You know, the virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son, and how he was born, and all of that. It all ties together. So you see his point here. His point is that, look, Paul knew Luke because he quoted him. Therefore, if Paul knew that Luke was teaching something that was untrue about Jesus' birth, virgin conception, birth, and so on, we would expect Paul to have mentioned it. And Paul just doesn't mention it. And then we have finally here, we got the three that we've already talked about. And then finally, Paul did mention Jesus' birth in Galatians chapter 4, when he is talking about the Judaizers and he is dealing with the false teaching of the Judaizers. And here's what he says. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. So here he is talking about Jesus being born of a woman. So clearly he knows Jesus was born of a woman, and what woman is that? Obviously that's Mary. And he's using this to support his claim that Jesus is the Christ and that there's no need to be under the law anymore. Jesus was born under the law to redeem those of us who are under it and cannot keep it. So he does know Jesus is born of a woman, and from this it's easy to conclude that he understood the rest of it as well. Now, let me make one final point on this because it comes up quite often in a lot of different spiritual contexts with the Bible. And that is the difference between modern Americans and what we think about and what we emphasize, and people in the ancient past in the Bible and what they thought was important and what they emphasized. And here's what I want to state about this. It is not fair to judge writers to be in error because they did not give emphasis on things we care about in the present. You see, that's what we're doing. We are going, gosh, this nativity is so important. Jesus' virgin birth is so important. And all these different things. We've got the things out, as we've mentioned. We've got them out in our lawns, and we've got them at our churches, and all this is so important. Well, maybe to them, that wasn't as important as some other things. Now, of course, it is important, his virgin conception and all of that, and that's well documented in the New Testament. We've shown you that. But sometimes we look back at the Bible and we go, why didn't they talk about this? And the answer is, that's important to you. That's what you have made important. That's not necessarily what is important to those apostles or the first early Christians. The things we are fascinated with are not necessarily those of the men and women of the Bible. We cannot judge their accuracy or their knowledge based on something we think is really important and needs to be talked about by everybody all the time. We need to let the Bible authors and the Bible writers choose for themselves what they needed to talk about given their purpose and their particular ministry. So Paul, it's not a fair objection to say that Paul didn't know about the Nativity because he didn't mention it in the way that we wanted him to. Love you in the Lord.